When I was a child, my parents and older siblings used to tell me scary stories of haunted houses, places, and tree houses. But I believed they were made-up stories meant to scare little children until my family and I moved into a new house 2 years ago. I have a 6-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old son, and for anonymity, I'll call them Sarah and Jackson. Long before my family and I moved into that new house, Sarah and Jackson had always wanted a treehouse, but for a lot of reasons, they couldn't have one. When my wife and I bought the property we currently live in, one of the highlights was the old treehouse in the yard. We felt like we had killed 2 birds with 1 stone, because we knew how excited the children would be when they saw the treehouse. Just as we expected, the kids loved the treehouse, and right after we moved in, it became their second home. My wife's only concern was that the wooden steps and a couple of other things in the treehouse were old and needed replacement, so I had to make sure they were safe for the kids. The first time I experienced something weird in that treehouse was on the first day I got in to repaint the woods for the kids. At first, I heard what sounded like a girl's giggling, and out of nowhere, one of the kids' electric toys came on and began to move without being controlled. I'll admit that it freaked me out, but I didn't think too much about it, and I continued with what I was doing. I didn't even mention the weird experience I had to my wife and kids because I didn't think it was anything serious. A couple of weeks after that weird experience, one day, I overheard my kids talking about the laughing girl in the treehouse and how their toys would be moved to another position without them moving them. They also spoke about the chances of the treehouse being haunted by a ghost, just as I often told them in the scary stories. It sounded funny when I overheard them because, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't believe in haunted houses or ghosts. I felt all the stories about haunted houses were all made up, and like every other person who thinks like that, I discarded the chances of that treehouse being haunted. It wasn't until something horrible happened in that treehouse. That day, Sarah had gone to play in the treehouse as usual, when she suddenly screamed, "Dad!" in a panic. My wife and I were inside the house when we heard her scream, and we rushed out to see what was happening. To our greatest surprise, Sarah had fallen in the treehouse, and she bruised her knees and arms badly. It was pretty alarming because she had never sustained so much injury. After we administered first aid and managed to make her calm, we tried to question her about what had happened, and all she could say was, "The laughing girl pushed me." She was so convinced that someone pushed her. Judging from the level of bruises on her knees and arms, it didn't make sense for Sarah to sustain that kind of injury by falling on her own. Even though my wife and I didn't want to admit it, we knew Sarah had been pushed. And if Jackson had been at home or around the treehouse at that time, we would have assumed he had pushed his sister. Concerning the laughing girl in the treehouse, aside from me, my wife claimed she had also overheard the children talking about the laughing girl in the treehouse a couple of times, and we knew it wasn't something both the kids would make up. I told her about my experience too, and that was when we began to look at the chances of the treehouse being haunted. Believe me, it was so bizarre for us to even consider the chances of being haunted by a ghost kid. After hesitating for days, we finally decided to do some digging on the house, and to our greatest horror, we found out that the original owner of the house had a 10-year-old daughter who died in that treehouse a long time ago. I won't be sharing details about her death, but her death was so tragic that it forced her parents to sell the house and move out because they couldn't bear the pain of her death. Also, before they moved out, the girl's parents claimed they could still hear their daughter's laughter coming from the treehouse. After our findings, We knew we were dealing with the spirit of the same girl. The kids and I had also heard her laughing in the treehouse. To cut the story short, my wife and I were forced to pull down the treehouse and burn everything that came with it. I know it's kinda cruel to the girl's spirit or whatever she is, but it was the only way to keep our kids safe. After we did that, everything just stopped, including her laughter and toys moving on their own. If I hadn't done that, maybe my family and I would have had a different story. For privacy, I won't be using any names in this story. I was around 12 to 13 years old when the kids in my neighborhood began to spread rumors of a haunted treehouse. Apparently, there was a kid who lived down the street with his parents and grandmom, and he was the only one who would let us play in his treehouse at the time. I remember vividly since I was 8, I and some other kids had been playing at this kid's treehouse, and we had never had any problems or encountered something weird until his parents passed away in a ghastly car accident, with him being the only survivor. After his parents' demise for about a year, we couldn't access the treehouse because the kid was going through a lot of emotional trauma. But after a year and some months, we saw the kids for one time. Then he and his grandmom had moved to a different city. When the other children and I heard that the kid had moved to a different city, we felt a bit sad because we would miss him and wouldn't get to play in his treehouse anymore. Sadly, the rumors of the haunted treehouse began to spread after the boy and his grandmom moved to a different city. According to some kids who went to the treehouse after the boy and his grandmom traveled, they claimed they saw clothes, shoes, and a couple of other belongings. But there was never anyone in the treehouse. I know this sounds like a not-so-supernatural story, but it is. When the rumor began to spread that the boy's treehouse was haunted, it scared children like me away for weeks. But at some point, some kids suspected that the other kids must have probably made up the story to scare other children from playing in the treehouse, so we devised a plan. That weekend, the plan was for me and 2 other boys to go to the treehouse and see things for ourselves. It wasn't easy for us because we were scared to our teeth, especially with the annoying birds hooting above us that evening. On getting inside the treehouse, we saw clothes, male and female clothing, and a young boy's clothes. It was just as the other kids had told us, but when we saw them, the first thing that came to mind was that the boy's grandmom must have forgotten some clothes in the treehouse. With this new perspective, the other 2 kids and I decided to play a bit in the treehouse before reporting to the other kids. And that's when things got very creepy. I think we'd just been playing for 5 minutes when one of us said that he felt like someone was watching us. He claimed he couldn't shake off the feeling, and to be sure that no one was watching us, we decided to look around the house. While looking around, we spotted someone who looked exactly like the boy's late dad hiding inside the house. He was watching us from the window facing the treehouse, and it was so apparent someone was watching us because we saw the curtain shift. It happened so fast. Even as teenage boys, we were sure of what we saw. When we all saw the man, the look on our faces said what our mouths could not say. In addition, the boy's house had been locked for more than 4 months, and no one lived in it. So even if we thought of saying, maybe the boy's uncle or relative must have moved into the house, it was impossible because no one had been inside there for months. Well, that was the last day the other kids and I stepped foot on the property. We were so shaken that we couldn't even tell our parents what we saw. The only explanation we had was that we saw the ghost of the boy's late dad. He was a man we all knew, and there was no way 3 teenage boys could have seen the same thing if it wasn't there. We never talked about our experience after that because we were so afraid. Anyway, so many years have passed, and I think sharing my supernatural experience is okay.